the breakup of the United Kingdom.
Self-deceptions are rooted in beliefs which at some point in the past we seriously entertained, as it was awareness of our faults and the pain that accompanied them that produced the deceptions in the first place. Thus, deep down it can be said that we all know the manner in which we deceive ourselves.
Friction with Westminster would be followed by fracture from Westminster.
400 years ago, wars raged between countries in Europe over religion, politics, and power. The world was made up of a handful of empires and small kingdoms. Religious and political authorities regularly fought bloody conflicts over territory and authority. Borders were not respected, and the world was often a free-for-all. The concept of sovereignty arose in the mid-17th century during a peace agreement, after one particularly destructive European conflict, the 30 Years' War.
And once gone, we couldn't recover our power. They'd be gone for good.
So now if we look at reasons for moving to the UK, and we see this split between people coming from the EU and those that were not from the EU. About half of the non-EU born migrants in the UK said they came to the country for family reasons in 2019, while the most common reason for migration among EU migrants was work. So you can already see some differences there. However, of course, for EU migrants, family reasons were also important. And study, again, also is an important factor for both groups. The UK is one of the most important countries for international students around the world.
Over the last 3 or 4 years, obviously, large numbers of people have engaged with conspiracy theory content. That could be anti-lockdown stuff, it could be COVID conspiracies, it could be anti-vaccine stuff, it could be all these various things. And we've talked about demonstrations on the streets with 10,000 people on listening to David Icke and those sorts of things. So the scene has been a worry for a while, of course. But what we've increasingly seen, as lockdown restrictions have eased, in some sense, this movement has got smaller because there are fewer people getting involved in a conspiracy theory groups, etc., and demonstrations, because the anger that mobilized it, like the lockdown, has dissipated. However, what we have seen is some of the individuals who've continued to be involved in this essentially have gone further down the rabbit hole, right? And by that, I mean, there is such a thing as super conspiracies, which is essentially when you bundle together multiple conspiracies in a hierarchy. And once you have this super conspiracy, it demands a conspirator, right? And invariably through history, we know that the conspirator is deemed to be the Jewish people. And so there are worryingly large numbers of people that got involved in anti-lockdown politics or maybe anti-vaccine stuff online that have gone further enough down that radicalization pathway to believing in some sort of grand conspiracy, whether or not that's the Jewish world conspiracy or the New World Order, QAnon. And that's really scary for those people, right? Because all of a sudden you go from being annoyed about something like lockdown to all of a sudden believing you've had your eyes open to a grand conspiracy that the world is secretly run by a pernicious force. And that belief system can, in their eyes, legitimize more extreme action. And so we've seen groups like Alpha Men Assemble and groups that have started to take on much more vocal, direct action sort of politics. We've seen that outside attacking journalists and the offices of journalists. We've seen training and those sorts of things. Essentially, the movement might be smaller, but going forward, it's getting more radical. And that's something to really, really watch out for. And it's something we're really concerned about. And then within that is this rise of the sovereign citizens idea, this kind of pseudo-legal language and text, which we've seen wrapped around the movement that many of you will have seen on your kind of bus stops and the like. And then I guess one of the things I'll finally touch on is the mainstreaming element of this. There's two things here. There is the mainstreaming of far-right individuals, and then there is the normalization of far-right rhetoric. And I think sometimes we confuse those. We have examples, for example, like The Spectator and a very large magazine writing puff pieces about Zemmour in France, or continuing to platform individuals or give jobs to individuals at The Spectator, some of which, like James Delingpole, are explicitly working with the extreme far right in the UK now. So this kind of cordon sanitaire that is supposed to keep the far right out of mainstream discourse, in some cases has crumbled. And we saw that with things like migrant hunters on talk radio. And we've, of course, seen that in numerous examples with GB News. Far-right individuals and figures entering the mainstream. But we've also seen a normalization of far-right rhetoric, which is where essentially the ideas and language of the far-right enter the mainstream. The best example of this, of course, was Boris Johnson at the Dispatch box talking about Keir Starmer attacking him around, saying he failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile. Now, anyone who monitors the far right over the last year or so will know that this is a rumor or a piece of disinformation that emerged out of the far right, that essentially worked its way up to the point where, I'm not saying Boris Johnson was sitting there reading Tommy Robinson's Telegram. That's not how this works. It happens osmotically. It builds through the movement until it breaks out of the far right. But we see this thing where we see far right rhetoric entering the mainstream. And another example of that is the migrant hunters, the language of the migrant hunters being echoed by some of the press releases we saw from the Home Office about gunboats in the Channel, and some of the language we see about the way we treat migrants and refugees. Again, we're seeing rhetoric that sounds indistinguishable from that of the far right in mainstream areas. And the very last thing I'll just cover before I hand back is I thought it'd be briefly worth touching on the far right in the UK's reaction to Ukraine, as everything that's been going on there. Now, I will say all of this is that the far right's involvement in the UK in this is an irrelevance in the grand scheme of things. So I understand why this might look like navel gazing, but I just thought it would be interesting to say, what are the far right here saying? And broadly speaking, the far right is split actually on Ukraine. They've found it quite complex. For some people within the far right, or large sections, Putin's authoritarianism, his illiberalism, has made him a bit of a darling of the European far right for the last few years. They talked about him as a protector of the West, as a protector of Judeo-Christian values. So for those individuals, some of them have been torn, right? So on the one hand, many of these people have kind of come out of this kind of slightly unshakable Cold War dichotomy, and they have slipped straight back into that. And it is the West versus Russia. So for some people in the far right, it's very simple. They are, it's gone back into those almost 1980s Cold Warrior stuff. And this is something we've seen with a lot of the Republican movement in America as well. For other people, though, in the movement, in the far right, there is this kind of such a deep-seated mistrust of the mainstream media, of politics, of politicians, of mainstream reports from the BBC, that they just disbelieve anyone who is mean about someone else, my enemy's enemy, if you will. And so those people have defended Putin. And these individuals often see Putin and Russia as a counterweight to American imperialism and liberalism. They see his kind of pushing back against NATO as a positive. They see his anti-Western rhetoric as a positive. And they see him as like this bulwark against globalism, which they disagree with. And for many of these, of course, for them, they will see this as being pushed by a Jewish kind of conspiracy underneath. So you do have those then, of course, that have been very, very pro-Putin. With the more extreme elements, say in some of the Nazi groups we monitor, this is just a tragedy because it's two white nations fighting. Right, so you can throw that element into there. This is a conflict, and this is nothing new in the far right. When they talk about the Second World War as a brothers' war, they see this in the same way. And then, of course, you have this other outlier, which is far right groupings who are very pro-Ukrainian in this battle, and this goes back to their involvement or their veneration of the Azov Battalion, which is a kind of neo-Nazi battalion in Ukraine that's been active in the anti-Russian work since 2014. And, this has been something that's been a big excitement for the global far right and the global neo-Nazi movement. And so some people have fallen into line and seen this as about self-determination of Ukraine, etc. So there is a diversity of views there. The one thing I would say, of course, is, the Azov Battalion are awful, but estimates place it around 900. So in the grand scheme of this wider war, it's a tiny element. And so I've just got a police car going past as a wider part of this. And so we need to be very careful about individuals that say Azov Battalion is a legitimization for Putin's action, which I don't think is the case at all. So across the far right, there is a diversity of views, is what I'd say. And so there's a very broad overview of the things. The other thing, of course, which is fundamentally important here is the much more explicit neo-Nazi scene and the really worrying far right terrorism.
I think what we've seen over the last decade or so is a large number of people looking, especially through social media, at the way other people live. And if you think about it, it was really difficult for people to migrate years ago. But now I think there's this demand from people to have higher standards of living. Years ago, they may not have known exactly what possibilities there were if they moved to Europe or North America or whatever. But now they do. So I think globalization has brought the world much more focused into one place, that people can see what's happening. I was in Myanmar, Burma recently, and everyone had a camera. Everyone had a phone. Everyone was watching what was going on. I was there 10 years ago, before the Saffron Revolution, and there was no internet. So now information, access, understanding is out there. So globalization has made it possible to understand the world in a way that you couldn't before. Technology has of course improved so people can travel more easily. People can be in touch through social media. Governments can't control traffickers who can communicate through encrypted servers and the like. So I think what globalization has done is facilitated what would have always been there, a desire to move, but it's made it more practical. And crucially, we all see it on our nightly televisions. We see the effects, we read about it, so it's absolutely in the public domain, in the public gaze in a way it would never have been before.
It was called the Peace of Westphalia, and it ushered in a world of countries that respected one another's independence. Today, there are almost 200 countries in the world. But outside of those, there are a number of groups, territories, and even governments that advocate or fight for becoming their own country. Not just anyone can claim sovereignty, though, and there can be disagreements as to what is considered a country and therefore eligible for this status. There are no clear rules or procedures for deciding who gets to form a sovereign country. And these efforts are often violent and prolonged. Violations of sovereignty and disputes over what constitutes a violation happen from time to time.
And that problem has to be faced up to. If you keep ignoring it, it will simply get worse until you can't ignore it any longer, and then you will have to face up to it. And things that can't go on forever don't. So that is the problem. That is the issue. That is what we're facing.
And the toilet of doom.
Bye-bye.
But they've seen it now, and that's true. So